Welcome to Extremism Channel with myself, Mr. J. Bora. And on today's show, I would just like to really talk around what is extremism and hopefully put into context what it is, help define it a bit better. Give and take, there are a lot of challenges with it, particularly in practice. Now, as I speak, there are a lot of challenges going on, particularly we've had the war between Hamas and Israel, which started 7th of October 2023. And no doubt that was very brutal in the way that it happened. And there's been a wide range of responses from the political arena, security services, and other individuals. We got United Nations and other individuals involved, a lot of casualties on both sides that have taken place. We've seen the way in which it was even planned, give and take. We watched the news and even showing to us that this was in the making. They had been planning all this. Now, equally, we've got a war in the Middle East, and now we've had the one that had already taken place within Europe between Russia and Ukraine. And no doubt there were ramifications there, particularly what's currently going on, which is still happening. We're talking about a ceasefire and we're talking about getting aid and people who need medical treatment. So obviously know that there's a lot of people have been affected, a lot of people have been displaced. But in terms of extremism and to understand what it is now, the word extremism really derives from the word extreme, which means it is a quality of state of being extreme. It's or an advocacy of extreme measures or views. Now, these are simply views that people have and decide to take it from one end to the other far end in terms of its extreme nature and in terms of its intensity. And they really want to really make a point or the voice to be heard and etc. etc. Now, it defines slightly different to the word radical, give and take. Radical, the term radical is being used particularly in a lot of academic literature and in history. But now extremism or extremist seems to now to be almost a topic of discussion everywhere you go. But I also like to point out that we have to view this in light of the British government's definition of extremism, because we can talk around there's a political extremist or we've got a religious extremist or someone who's a social extremist, but it's defining these. Now, we currently had a review of the counter-terrorism strategy in the UK called Prevent by William Shawcross, CBO, who actually identified some areas of their challenges and things that need to be explored. We remember our history, what happened here in the West in 9/11 September with Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and what he was responsible for, and give and take, he was another individual that was recognized as a severe threat to the West. Give and take, it issued two fatwas against America in 1996 and 1998, and then we saw what happened in 2001, and we had also the threat and the risk of radicalization in the UK, July the 7th, we had the Madrid bombings, and we've had the killer of Drummond Lee Rigby, the Manchester attacks. So it seems to really have now opened itself up, and give and take also what has happened within the Middle East has had great, as I mentioned earlier, ramifications, because we've had marches, protests, threats have been made. To what extent is radicalization going again to be on another scope or another level within the UK? Again, the threats have been made, of course, for jihad against the UK and the government and other individuals because of the involvement or support for, say, for Israel. These are areas that all need to be explored. Now, we can talk around security services who check the threat of actual or credible threats to the UK, and JTAC, Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, that examine all these threats. We've got new legislation far as the current director of MI5 is concerned, the National Security Act 2023, which really deals with a lot of international and foreign threats. So they were really happy that that was literally passed by Parliament, which is literally this year. But to sort of bring it back into context of what is the UK's response, and how did they define this in the terms of focusing it and really making sure that it was tailored for people in the UK and giving take the international threats at the time. We've seen it in our history over the years, particularly way back from the 18th, 19th century. We can talk about even Guy Fawkes, who put the plot to blow up Parliament and the state opening at the time when King James was the king. And we can talk all the way down. We talked about the Birmingham pub bombings. There's been that way in the 70s, the Panama bombings. There's been a lot of history. We talk about even in the 90s with the development and the literal commissioning of a two-part report around terrorism laws in the UK that needed to be expanded upon from a political and religious point of view. Lord Lloyd of Berwick was responsible for that. And then that was picked up again by the Labour Party in 1997 onwards, and they enacted the first comprehensive piece of legislation, the Terrorism Act 2000, and Lord Carlisle, straight after 2001, was responsible to continue to develop these laws to protect and better serve the British public. And we've had them consistently since the time of Lord Carlisle up until this current day. But in terms of the British context now, when we define extremism, it is interesting to note that the extremism also, in my view, is something that can also detach us from reality. To someone who has a state of a transcendence from one state to the extreme, and there seems to be a process that takes place now, give and take, that radicalization as compared to say extremism, and radicalization is actually the process by which someone comes to support terrorism. Extremism, that is a more of a process that someone can go through, which can take weeks, months, or years to materialize, and in terms of its severity can end up in, say, an act of terrorism or something else. But as its starting point, now, extremism is also, I say, destructive to the ideals of others. It can reduce a person's ability to see themselves as others do. There's some sense of distortion going on there. But now here is the definition of the British government's approach. Definitely, by definition, in the counterterrorism contest strategy, which was launched in 2003, just after 9/11, give and take the threats that were made to the UK, which were recognized by MI5 and other security services at the time, by Al Qaeda and other groups, and we've seen Daesh and others, even the far right wing in this country, an extreme right wing, but particularly from, say, Islamist ideology, or the threats that were made, given type the groups that have been prescribed and banned from operating in the UK. And we've seen a lot of arrests here since 7/7 in the UK. But the British context talks around, and this is the definition, that extremism as defined in context is the vocal or active opposition to our fundamental values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and respect and tolerance for different faiths or beliefs, and also regards for the call of the death of our armed forces. What an interesting definition there. In terms of, it says it's the opposition to fundamental values. Yet when you see in training all over, in Prevent and what was deployed by RAP and the Home Office and others, they talk about British values, and British values is very much at the core of a lot of training, and people in schools or in criminal justice and other related sectors in youth work had to get to grips with understanding British values. And this was one of the challenges, because who defines British values? What are British values? Which is another thing that is very, very challenging to define. However, this is the UK's definition of extremism. Is someone who calls or is the vocal or active opposition to fundamental values, including democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, and respect for tolerance of people of different faith. We see that with terrorist groups now, even though terrorists may be a bit more politically motivated, say someone who's extremism, who's an extremist by nature, wants to protest about something else, or has a voice and goes on a march or campaigns, but has no intention of engaging in any act of violence. And we've seen that reflected in the legislation and other policies and documents. We also saw when David Cameron came into power as the Prime Minister from 2010 to 15, particularly in the coalition government, he also called Gaza an open prison. We've seen what's going on there currently because of the tension that were taking place. So these individuals have recognized and identified some of these key threats and what could filter, particularly within the UK, which it has historically. And he also was responsible, David Campbell, for setting up the Extreme Task Force Group with an aim to disrupt extremists and counter-extremist narratives and ideologies, preventing radicalization and stopping extremism institutions, including schools and in universities and other places where they seem to present themselves. We've had also the Trojan horse scandal in Birmingham here that happened in 2015 upwards, or 14 upwards, where it was recognized there were particular religious groups that were giving people certain views or talks or lectures around hardcore views, extremist views, and it was identified as Islamic, though give and take is the current biggest threat to the UK from Islamic extremism, followed by the far right and others. We've got the political groups. But to what extent are the actions and events of this particular current war or religious or political war, depending which way you view it, going to affect people in the UK. We've seen hundreds and thousands of people marching all over the place. But by definition, if people are calling for the vocal or active opposition to British values, then to what extent are these individuals saying that these values are not the values of the wider British people, depending on how you define the word British? Or a citizen for that matter, give and take. Even we talk about the migrants, what happened in Ireland the other day or recently with the riots. Again, one of the chief police officers were known to say that those individuals, particularly from a white background, were radicalized. These were individuals because of the tension and putting the threat to community cohesion and integration and inclusion. So therefore, we see now, how do we then put these individuals by reason of them being extremists? Do we have to follow through with some violence, or do we have to adopt the ideology that is specifically targeting a group, person, or institution? Give and take, the terrorism legislation talks around the cause and also the violence and give and take the terrorism laws that happened or developed within the UK. There were a lot of areas that recognize individuals who were doing things publicly under the banner of free speech and using democracy. We saw that with Abu Hamza, who was arrested, Adem Chowdhury, very much individuals who called for the caliphate and other individuals to be governed by, say, Sharia or other laws that were not compatible with British values or the British law court system within the UK. These are the areas that we find very challenging at the moment, that need to be recognized and identified. If these individuals have adopted that extremist view or narrative, for that matter, from groups, and we can talk about areas that have been funded by groups. And we know also in England, we're talking about extremism and identifying it. People who are raising money. That's why terrorism law 2005 and 6 and 8 had to come along and were implemented by recognizing people who were glorifying acts of terrorism on the streets of the UK. We saw these individuals, even what happened on 9/11. Individuals were calling bin Laden a hero. There were a lot of things that were taking place, but we also had a very big review of Prevent by William Shawcott, CVO, which I mentioned earlier. And give and take our history in the UK, there's a lot of history in the UK, particularly in terms of how, say, children's services and other areas that have been developed. We can talk around the NSPCC back in 1899 that was developed. We can talk about the history of the Children's Charter. We're talking about protecting children and young people from extremism or adopting extremism views and those at risk of radicalization. We talk about Channel, the areas that have been identified by Channel, and supporting those at risk and the objectives that are defined within the Prevent agenda that will help individuals who are at risk or recognizing by being recruited. So recruitment was a very big problem. We've got online recruitment, we've got social media that seems to radicalize people literally within their own bedrooms, and lone actors and lone individuals. We've got mental health, and this is what's recognized by Channel, who bring together all the expertise and identified the different areas of grievances and people with the different types of emotions and feelings and mental health. Now they recognize 3 areas about engagement and capability and intent. Just because someone may engage in a particular discussion or a particular march, protest that seems to be very extreme, and I gave the definition earlier, does that mean they are an extremist? Are they a threat to national security, to public safety? These are the areas that need to be recognized and understood. What are some of the extremist views that people hold? But to what extent are they very dangerous indeed? Or what extent can they become radicalized? Give and take, remember what happened on Christmas Day a few years ago. The name of Jaswant Singh was responsible for going to the grounds of Windsor Castle to go and to attack the Queen with a crossbow. And he was more to do with the tension between India and England. So you see, these are individuals we have to identify. Now, he had a mental health condition as well, which is recognized. So these are the areas that we need to really focus upon when we are defining extremism. But the challenge within frontline delivery or people's assessments or understanding the different type of assessments, where do we refer people? We can talk about Channel and some of the statistics that show there's been a slight increase of children and young people to be referred to programs of early intervention. Now, as far as early intervention is concerned, from an extremism point of view, then therefore to protect and safeguard, it's also about safeguarding vulnerable, which is what the Counter-Terrorism Security Act 2015 has done, prevent statutory and power and statutory footing, really in part 5, section 26, which talks about do you regard to prevent those that are being drawn into terrorism? But in order to do that and prevent that, they have to recognize that. So where do we recognize it? Is there an identity conflict with an individual who seems to see themselves as British or non-British, so therefore they will not be defending British values because they seem to be going against British values. Either some mental health condition, psychosis, or schizophrenia, which is recognized with some of these attacks, both in the UK and American and wider field, give and take the Global Terrorism Data Index global database that recognizes and brings together some of the statistics regarding these attacks. What about trauma and abuse? For that matter, we need to look at what areas are we looking at. Why are people engaging in acts of extremism? Because I'm talking about the show, it's about what is extremism and defining it very, very carefully instead. And not some people have misunderstood it, or it's been misleading when people talk about it. Now, this is the thing that William Shawcross also identified in the Prevent review. He said about this appears to be a lack of consistent understanding within Prevent as to the nature of, say, Islamist ideology and its deployment is in Islamic scripture. There's people that don't understand it when they're delivering Prevent, for example, give and take. We're talking about some of the biggest threats to the UK. It is also a common mistake in the wider field to equate ideological motivation with theological literacy or intellectual capacity. These are the areas that need to be considered. And he also mentioned Prevent must be consistent in the threshold that it applies across the ideology to ensure a proportionate and effective response. These are individuals, therefore, that are delivering Prevent, understand what is extreme, what is safe, what is dangerous, what can be a potential threat, or what is a risk. That's what extremism is about, understanding it. And therefore, this is the whole point, that when people are delivering an agenda that is very complex, to say the least, is rooted in, say, psychology as well, and rooted in politics or history, they have to understand to what extent is someone adopting something. And now, I don't think anybody, for that matter, because radicalization is difficult and extremism groups and terrorists does not seem to be dissolved overnight, and it's literally here now in the streets of the UK because it's been called again, as we saw in our history before, on July 7/7, for attacks within the UK to take place, again, to radicalize individuals. And we have seen a lot of fragmentation, a lot of social divides or racial divide. We could talk about racial extremism, which will be going on in depth into this particular show. I will also talk about the three areas where I see where we need to focus on, about the casual approach and the focused approach and the targeted approach to deal with extremism. These are the areas that we must focus our attention on if we are going to be successful in dealing with extremism at the earliest stages. It is about early identification. These are some of the areas when we see what happened with children, young people who, at the hands of a parents, now we could talk about how parents may be the responsible perpetrators for radicalizing their children. With Victoria Climby, and we've talked about the Cleveland report and what happened in our history, the significant failures from Professor Monroe around child protection, about communication, information sharing. These are critical parts, ingredients, infrastructures to the whole process around preventing extremism. Now, we learn these lessons in order to be applied somewhere else and not make the same mistakes again. This is what we're saying when it comes to extremism. If you identify something and you see something of a concerning nature, you have that entitlement and that legal approach or that backing to raise it, and also to probably discuss it, whether you're talking around within the criminal justice system, some voluntary or charity, some other sector, is to recognize the early signs of indication. And we talk about push factors and pull factors, what's going to push someone towards that, what's going to pull someone towards extremism. However, it becomes a bit more problematic and very challenging if it's in isolation or away from the public domain. This is very challenging for individuals delivering the work because you just don't know where they are, where they're living, unless some intelligence comes out, which is why intelligence services must act very quickly when a piece of intelligence has come. And again, we've seen significant failures with security services, for that matter, who could have prevented a possible attack just by some of the information. We've seen it again with Hamas and Israel, about the intelligence has been questioned. Again, did they know about it? We talked about how they were planning it for 2-3 years before that, and certain signs or indications were given. Certain messages in the media were given, and it's for people who are working in these intelligence services to decode that and understand it and read and see a pattern. If we can see the pattern, then we are going to be in a very comfortable position to disrupt it. That's what it is all about. And as I'm raising you on an extremism channel, is about early identification to the point where we can disrupt some of these. David Anderson, or Baron Anderson, who is one of the former independent reviewers of legislation, talked about it in one of his reports in 2015. He mentioned about some of these individuals were caught and plots were foiled, which there have been also within the UK, by people that were just sitting in cafes or parks, and they were having discussions, and that's where they were identified. And people picked the phone up and rang the emergency services or police or security services to inform that, because there are a lot of information or communication available. This is what we talk about: early indication and recognition of something. Now, these are things that I used to deal with myself, give and take, doing my studies in terrorism and law and global security in Prevent, and having attended myself to consultations with key individuals and engaged in documentaries and interviews. This is something I recognized and I identified at the earliest stages. If we can challenge it or develop analytical skills, as one academic said from King's College, about recognizing earlier ways of developing analytical skills and build up some resilience, whether it's emotional resilience or some other form of resilience, to prevent or disrupt extremism, then that's going to make things even easier, our job even easier, to develop these skills with young people and children, to challenge something that it could be dangerous, or challenge a narrative, wherever simple form it comes in, whatever narration it comes in, is to challenge these things as they come along. And that is the duty of every individual. We talk about our duty to safeguard individual. We have a duty of care, and we hear all these terms. So don't we have a duty of care, as far as extremism is concerned, to help individuals at risk of being drawn? We know what the legislation says, and that has come along the CTSA 2015. But also as individuals, to better serve the public and protect us, we have to understand what is extremism. Now, William Shawcross did say in the report, we need to go more deeper, have a more thorough look into some of these narratives that people don't understand, what they're all about, what do they consist of, why are they formed, to what extent are they dangerous. We can talk around people's views or opinions, but to what extent does an opinion border an extremist view, for that matter, or encourage it? We've seen it again identified in Prevent reports and in the Prevent consultation and documentation about radical individuals and hardcore extremists and religious extremists like Syed Qutb, for example, writing against the West and how to engage in jihad, and talking about the democracy, the law, and the different types of systems that are not compatible with a particular religion. These are areas that need to be challenged thoroughly and understood. These are one of the challenges, I would say, weaknesses in Prevent delivery and understanding extremism. To what extent something dangerous? You could be working with someone who may not agree with you. These were some of the challenges within institutions and delivering of services, that people are not confident to challenge something that they thought they may offend someone. Now, if you're going to offend somebody to the point of protecting somebody, you need to examine that again, because that may be safe to do so. If you're offending it just for offending's sake, that's a different matter. However, for Prevent, as I said earlier, and I mentioned, is a vocal or active opposition to fundamental values and individual liberty. So that really gives you some sort of indication of where you can defend something, where you can challenge something comfortably. So your templates and your risk assessments are very critical, important, and to be understood that this is what we are talking about. And we can quote a lot of academics, and we know Martha Crenshaw and Brian Jenkins and Alex B. Schmid. All these individuals. I remember the book written by Dr. Steve Hewitt, The British War on Terror, that talked about all these 12-point plans from the previous Prime Minister Tony Blair and others to disrupt and challenge the terrorists and extremists wherever they present themselves. But I do believe we are on a new challenge in this 21st century, what's currently happening, and yet the wave, and yet what's on the horizon, given 2024 is just a few weeks away. I see a lot of challenges going on there. I can see a lot of things happening on there. And I think we have to be very more cognizant now and really understand it a lot more better. But I hope this understands defining what extremism is and to what extent we can literally be able to target it and manage it a lot better. Thank you for joining me today. And don't forget to subscribe.